The air was a wet, living thing that clung to Miller's skin like a second uniform. It tasted of mold, diesel, and something vaguely metallic like old blood. 2 weeks in country, and his body was still fighting it. The humidity, a suffocating blanket beneath the triple-layered canopy that choked out the sun. He was a new FNG, a fresh new guy, attached to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. They'd dumped him into the Quang Tri province, a place that, even on a map, looked like the armpit of creation. The jungle didn't just surround them, it consumed them. Every step on the sodden earth was a struggle, his boots sinking into mud that threatened to swallow them whole. His M16 felt heavier with each passing hour, the webbing of his gear digging into his shoulders. Sweat ran in rivers down his back, stinging his eyes, mixing with the ever-present grime that coated everything. The veteran grunts, the ones with the 1,000-yard stares and the faded patches, moved with a weary efficiency Miller could only envy. They walked silently, eyes scanning, ears cocked, their senses honed to a razor's edge. Miller, still clumsy, still flinching at every snap of a twig, felt like a neon sign broadcasting their presence. Sergeant Reyes, a wiry Chicano from East LA with a permanent scowl etched into his face, was point. He moved like a ghost, his machete occasionally flashing to clear a path through the impossibly thick undergrowth. Behind him was Doc Riley, the medic, a kid barely older than Miller, but with a haunted look that suggested he'd seen things no man should. Then came Miller, followed by Private Jenkins, a slow-talking farm boy from Tennessee whose endless stream of nervous chatter was the only thing preventing Miller from succumbing completely to the jungle's oppressive silence. The rest of the squad fanned out, a loose line of exhausted, watchful men. They were on a reconnaissance patrol, searching for a suspected VC staging area near a stretch of river that the maps just called the Serpent's Coil. It was their 3rd patrol in 4 days, each one a grinding test of endurance. Sleep was a luxury, fitful and broken by the symphony of unseen insects and the distant rumble of artillery. Food was sea rations, cold and bland, but necessary fuel. Water, precious and always rationed, tasted of iodine and plastic. Stay sharp, FNG, Reyes had grunted earlier, without looking back. Ain't no goddamn deer in these woods. He meant the unseen enemy, the ghost in the leaves, the shadow that waited. Miller had understood. He gripped his M16 tighter, his thumb hovering near the safety. Every bush seemed to hide a glint, every rustle a threat. The jungle itself was the enemy, or at least its accomplice. It hid the booby traps, punji stakes coated in shit, tripwires leading to grenades, bouncing Bettys waiting to jump and explode at waist height. Suddenly, Reyes froze. One hand shot up, palm flat, a silent command to stop. The entire patrol ceased moving, melting into the dense foliage as best they could. The only sound was the frantic buzz of insects and the rapid hammering of Miller's own heart. He pressed himself against the trunk of a massive, moss-covered tree, its bark rough and damp against his cheek. He tried to mimic the stillness of the others, to quiet his breathing, to hear what Reyes had heard. Nothing, only this ceaseless hum of the jungle. Then a faint, rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk dash, distant, muffled, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a shovel hitting earth. Digging. Reyes slowly lowered his hand, then motioned for Doc Riley to move up. Riley, eyes wide but calm, slipped past Miller, moving with an unnerving grace. He dropped to a crouch beside Reyes, who pointed ahead, gesturing with his fingers to indicate numbers, perhaps 3 or 4. Miller watched, his stomach twisting into a knot. This wasn't a contact, not yet, but it was the prelude. It was the moment before the storm, the breath held before the dive. He felt the dull ache in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his legs, but it was overshadowed by a cold clarity that cut through the humidity. This was it. This was why they were here. Not for glory, not for freedom, but for this raw, terrifying moment, hidden in the heart of a jungle that wanted to swallow them whole. The true hell had always been in the waiting, the anticipation of the horrors yet to unfold. The cold clarity shattered. It wasn't a sudden explosion. Not a deafening volley, but a single, wet thud, like a hammer striking rotten fruit. Then a guttural scream, cut short, bubbling into a choked gasp. Miller, already low, instinctively dropped flat, pressing his face into the damp, leech-infested earth. The air, thick with the smell of decay and impending rain, now carried the metallic tang of fresh fear. Contact! Right flank, someone roared, the voice thin and reedy, already cracking under the strain. Then the jungle erupted. AK-47s chattered with an angry, mechanical snarl, a sound distinct from the familiar, sharper crack of their M16s. Muzzle flashes, brief and violent, stitched through the dense foliage like angry, red eyes. Tracer rounds, like malevolent fireflies, danced through the gloom, seeking flesh. The world telescoped, narrowing to the immediate circumference of Miller's shivering body. His ears screamed, not just from the incoming fire, but from the sudden, visceral horror that punched him in the gut. This wasn't training. This wasn't a drill. This was the real, wet, brutal thing. He fumbled with his M16, the stock slick with sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a desperate drumbeat demanding escape. His breath hitched, raw and shallow. He tasted dust, mud, and the bitter copper of adrenaline. Ahead, Private Rodriguez, a kid barely out of high school, was sprawled face down, his uniform blossoming crimson around his spine. No sound from him, just the sickening gurgle that had silenced his scream. A booby trap, not even direct fire. The VC didn't need to show their faces to kill you. The jungle did their dirty work. Grenade! The warning was swallowed by the din. A dull thump from somewhere deep in the green hell, then the high-pitched whistle, growing rapidly. Miller didn't think. He just burrowed, clawing at the earth, trying to disappear into the soil itself. The explosion tore through the canopy, a concussive wave that slapped him, rattling his teeth, filling his nose with the pungent smell of spent ordnance and scorched earth. Splinters of wood and shrapnel rained down, some tearing through the leaves above him with the sound of ripping silk. He risked a glance. Sergeant Davies, his face a mask of grim determination, was already laying down suppressive fire, his M16 barking in short, controlled bursts. Return fire. Engage, he bellowed, his voice straining. Don't just lay there and piss your pants, you grunts. Laying down. Miller rolled onto his side, the weight of his pack digging into his ribs. He squinted through the oppressive humidity, trying to spot a target. But there was nothing, just the shimmering green wall of the jungle, alive with unseen death. He squeezed off a burst, aiming at nothing in particular, just the general direction of the muzzle flashes. The recoil was a familiar comfort, a concrete action in a world gone abstract. He emptied half a magazine in blind fury, a desperate plea for self-preservation. A sickening crack echoed nearby, and a grunt from Spec, 4 Johnson, positioned a few feet to Miller's left. Johnson convulsed, his hands flying to his chest, eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror before collapsing in a heap. A sniper. They were everywhere, unseen, unheard until the bullet found its mark. The sheer unfairness of it, the faceless enemy, the ambush from an invisible hand, twisted Miller's gut. This wasn't a fair fight. This was a slaughter in the dark. The air became thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and blood. The jungle, usually a symphony of buzzing insects and chirping birds, was now a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and the groans of the wounded. Miller felt a wet warmth spread across his thigh. He looked down, heart seizing. Not blood, just mud, churned up by the blast, mixed with rainwater and God knew what else. A cold wave of relief, followed by a deeper wave of shame for that relief. He saw Private Ramirez, the new guy, frozen, his eyes wide, fixed on Johnson's inert form. Terror had taken root. Ramirez, fire. God damn it, fire. Miller screamed, his voice raw, but Ramirez didn't move. He just stared, lost in the immediate, paralyzing horror. A fatal mistake. A burst of AK fire tore into the young private, lifting him off his feet before slamming him back down into the red mud. 3 down in less than 2 minutes. Sergeant Davies was crawling towards Miller, low and fast, his face smeared with grime and sweat. Fall back to the creek bed. Cover us." His voice was a strained whisper, cutting through the chaos. "Miller, help Johnson. See if he's still breathing." Miller hesitated. Johnson was clearly dead. He'd seen enough. But Davies was a machine, driven by duty, by a stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind. He crawled over, the effort immense, every muscle screaming. Johnson was sprawled, eyes vacant, a dark, ragged hole in his chest. No pulse, not even a twitch. A fly's feast already taking shape. "He's gone, Sarge," Miller choked out, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Davies just grunted, not looking. "Then cover fire. Move, move, move." He pushed Miller forward, a hand on his back. The retreat was a brutal, desperate scramble through razor grass and tangled roots. Every step a risk, every rustle a potential threat. The VC weren't pursuing aggressively, content to harry their flanks, to remind them that the jungle was a grave, and they were merely delaying the inevitable. The creek bed offered a temporary reprieve, a muddy ditch with steep banks offering some cover from the unseen enemy. But the air here was thick with mosquitoes and the stench of stagnant water. They huddled, panting, their faces pale and streaked with mud and blood. Sergeant Davies quickly took a head count, his gaze lingering on the empty spots where Rodriguez, Johnson, and Ramirez had been. 3 fresh graves in the jungle's embrace. Miller's hands trembled, his M16 feeling impossibly heavy. The cold clarity he'd felt before the storm was gone, replaced by a searing, irrational rage, a primal fear, and an exhaustion that gnawed at his very bones. This was the hell, not the waiting, but the sudden, brutal, relentless reality of it. The jungle hadn't just swallowed them. It was actively chewing, digesting them, one bloody piece at a time. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The true horrors had indeed unfolded, and more waited just beyond the next leaf, the next shadow, the next breath. The ringing silence after the last burst of M16 fire was heavier than the preceding cacophony. It vibrated in Miller's bones, a physical pressure against his eardrums. The metallic tang of spent gunpowder mingled with the humid, cloying scent of blood and rotting vegetation. His chest heaved, each breath a raw, ragged rasp in his throat, the air thick with fear and the adrenaline that now coursed through him like a poison. Rage, cold and precise, still simmered beneath the surface, but it was being rapidly replaced by a crushing exhaustion that threatened to collapse him where he stood or knelt, rather, propped against a moss-slicked tree trunk, M16 still clutched tightly in trembling hands. "Status report." Sergeant O'Malley's voice, hoarse and strained, cut through the oppressive stillness. Miller pushed himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. His uniform, already plastered to his skin with sweat, was now stained darker in places he didn't want to examine too closely. The jungle around them, moments ago a roaring, spitting maw of death, had reverted to its deceptive calm, the chirps and buzzes of unseen insects resuming their ancient chorus as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. He moved cautiously, weapon at the low ready, boots squelching in the mud. 2 figures lay unmoving. Corporal Davies, eyes wide and staring at the canopy, a dark, blossoming stain spreading across his chest. No point checking him. Sergeant Riley was groaning, clutching his thigh, blood seeping between his fingers. Doc Jenkins was already there, ripping open an aid kit, his face a mask of grim determination. Miller flanked security. "Torres, cover Jenkins." O'Malley barked, his voice betraying a raw edge that wasn't usually there. He was checking the perimeter himself, a gaunt, furious shadow amongst the towering trees. Miller knelt beside a clump of ferns, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. Every shadow was a potential ambush, every rustle of leaves a whispered threat. His mind was a jumbled mess of images. The sudden flash of muzzle fire, the screams, the sickening thud of rounds impacting flesh, the desperate, almost animalistic urge to kill or be killed. He felt a profound disconnect, as if watching himself from a distance, a marionette strung on wires of pure survival instinct. The irrational rage was morphing into a hollow, brittle despair. This wasn't combat. This was a meat grinder, and they were the meat. Hours blurred into a hazy eternity. Jenkins worked with brutal efficiency on Riley, his face pale beneath the grime. They patched up a few minor scrapes, distributed what little water they could spare, a warm, metallic taste that did little to quench the gnawing thirst. The decision was made. They couldn't hold position. Too exposed. They had to move, despite the wounded, despite the crushing exhaustion that had settled deep in their bones. "All right, listen up," O'Malley whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Riley's on the stretcher. Everyone else, watch your step. And for Christ's sake, watch the trees." He meant snipers, or booby traps, anything else this hell-bound jungle could throw at them. The march was an agony. Each step was a battle against the sucking mud that threatened to steal their boots, against the tangled vines that snaked across the forest floor like tripwires, against the thick, oppressive air that clung to their skin like a suffocating shroud. They moved in single file, their eyes darting, their senses frayed. The weight of their packs, already unbearable, felt exponentially heavier with Riley's stretcher, a bulky, cumbersome burden that snagged on every obstacle. Miller took his turn carrying the rear end of the stretcher, feeling the slight sway of Riley's body, the shallow, painful breaths. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain through the wounded man, and a fresh wave of guilt through Miller. They were moving him, but were they saving him? Or just dragging out his suffering? The jungle pressed in, a living, breathing entity that sought to consume them. It wasn't just the heat, though that was a constant, debilitating furnace. It was the absolute, suffocating humidity that made every breath a struggle, filling their lungs with damp, heavy air. It was the pervasive smell of decay, rotting leaves, stagnant water, the faint, sickening sweetness of decomposing flesh that could have been animal, or worse. Swarms of mosquitoes, thick as fog, found every inch of exposed skin, their high-pitched whine a constant, maddening soundtrack. Leeches, fat and black, attached themselves to ankles and wrists, draining blood slowly, insidiously. The skin beneath Miller's uniform was a landscape of bites, scratches, and weeping sores from jungle rot, festering in a relentless moisture. Miller felt the edges of reality fraying. Sleep deprivation was a cruel master. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every tree trunk momentarily resembled a lurking figure. He saw flashes of home, his mother's kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, only for the illusion to shatter into the harsh green reality of Vietnam. He'd blink hard, trying to clear his vision, but the phantom images persisted, whispers of a life he might never return to. His mouth was a desert, his throat raw. They were rationing water so severely that each sip was a torment, a cruel tease. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a dull ache that grew sharper with every passing hour. His body was protesting, screaming for rest, for sustenance, for a moment of peace. But there was no peace. They paused briefly by a sluggish stream, its water murky and still. O'Malley, ever vigilant, scanned the banks. No filling canteens, he whispered, his voice raspy. Too risky. Just enough to wet your lips. The bitter disappointment was a physical blow. Miller dipped his fingers in the lukewarm water, pressing the dampness to his cracked lips. It offered no relief, only magnified the thirst. They pushed on, the sun dipping below the dense canopy, plunging the jungle into a deep, oppressive twilight. The air cooled slightly, but the humidity remained, trapping the sweat against their skin. The sounds of the jungle intensified, the guttural calls of unseen creatures, the rustle of leaves that could be an animal or could be the enemy. Paranoia was a living thing, crawling under their skin, whispering doubts and threats in their ears. Then a sudden, muffled click. Miller froze, every fiber of his being screaming. Ahead of him, Private Henderson, carrying the front of Riley's stretcher, had taken one step too many. His foot was suspended, just barely, above a tripwire, a thin, almost invisible strand stretched taut between two roots. Time stretched, warped. Henderson's eyes, wide with terror, met Miller's. The stretcher dipped precariously. Riley groaned, stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Don't move," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible, a dry rasp. "Henderson, don't move a muscle." But the jungle, it seemed, wasn't done chewing. A distant, mocking chuckle seemed to echo through the trees. Or perhaps it was just the wind, or the sound of Miller's own sanity unraveling. The horrors weren't just unfolding. They were playing a cruel, drawn-out symphony. And the next note, Miller knew with chilling certainty, was about to drop. "Don't move," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible, a dry rasp. "Henderson, don't move a muscle." But the jungle, it seemed, wasn't done chewing. A distant, mocking chuckle seemed to echo through the trees, or perhaps it was just the wind, or the sound of Miller's own sanity unraveling. The horrors weren't just unfolding. They were playing a cruel, drawn-out symphony. And the next note, Miller knew with chilling certainty, was about to drop. It wasn't a sound that tipped him off first, not precisely. It was a shift in the air, a subtle displacement of the heavy, humid stillness that hung like a shroud over the forest floor. A new scent, alien and sharp, cut through the familiar stink of decay and damp earth. Wood smoke, faint and acrid, clinging to something else. Cheap tobacco and the undeniably human tang of stale sweat. Miller froze, every nerve ending screaming. His eyes, already strained from hours of scanning the oppressive green, narrowed further, darting through the lattice of ferns and tangled roots in front of their shallow hide. Henderson, still half delirious, gave a weak groan, attempting to shift his weight to ease the agony of his mangled leg. Miller's hand, slick with sweat and grime, clamped down on his comrade's shoulder with surprising force, pinning him. "Stay down. God damn it," he mouthed, no sound escaping, only the fierce tension in his jaw communicating the urgency. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement, not a bird or a breeze, but a deliberate, slow parting of the foliage 20 yards distant. A boot, camouflaged and mud-caked, emerged, followed by the hem of dark fatigues. Then another boot, then the barrel of an AK-47 held low and ready. A small patrol, 2, maybe 3 figures, ghostly silent, moving with the practiced stealth of predators in their native hunting grounds. They weren't sweeping, they were stalking, and they were coming directly for their position. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence of the jungle. He could feel the pulse throb in his temples, hear the rush of blood in his ears. Every instinct screamed for him to move, to drag Henderson, to open fire, to do anything dash. But his training, honed by weeks of terror, locked him down. One wrong twitch, one sudden breath, and it was over. He squeezed his eyes shut for a microsecond, forcing his mind to clear. Scan, assess, react. He opened them again, vision sharpened by adrenaline. The first figure was closer now, a lean, wiry man whose face was a study in grim concentration, shaded by the brim of a straw hat. His eyes, black and unblinking, swept the undergrowth. Miller felt a cold dread seep into his bones as those eyes seemed to linger, just for a breath, on the exact spot where they lay. He held his own breath, willing his body to become one with the earth, with the decaying leaves, with the very rock. Henderson whimpered, a choked sound. His body tensed, an involuntary spasm of pain. Miller felt a fresh wave of panic. He pressed harder on Henderson's shoulder, a silent plea, a desperate command. The weight of his M16, resting across his chest, felt both impossibly heavy and utterly useless. He couldn't engage, not with Henderson compromised, not with him so exposed. The lead NVA soldier paused, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a whisper only he could hear. Miller's breath hitched. Had he heard Henderson? Had he smelled them? The air was thick with the threat of imminent discovery. Time stretched, elastic and agonizing, each second a minute, each minute an eternity. The second soldier, younger, carrying an RPG slung across his back, came into view, stopping beside the first. They exchanged a look, a brief, silent communication that Miller couldn't decipher but understood implicitly. Something is here, Dash. Miller's gaze flickered to Henderson. His comrade's eyes were open now, wide and unfocused, staring up into the canopy, unaware of the death stalking inches from their faces. A thin trickle of saliva escaped the corner of his mouth. He was fading. The NVA point man shifted his weight, his boot crunching softly on a dry leaf. The sound was deafening in Miller's ears. The soldier raised his AK slightly, just enough for the muzzle to sweep across their hiding spot. Miller could see the glint of the front sight. His finger, already on the trigger guard of his M16, tightened. He was moments, fractions of a second, from firing, from unleashing hell, from signing their death warrant. But the soldier, after another agonizing moment, lowered his weapon. He grunted something to his comrade, a low, guttural sound. Then, with a fluid motion, he turned, melting back into the jungle, followed by the second soldier. They passed. The sudden absence of the threat was almost as terrifying as its presence. The jungle seemed to exhale, releasing its held breath. Miller lay there, rigid, listening, straining to hear any sound, any rustle that might indicate they had circled back. Only the buzzing of insects, the distant calls of unseen birds, and the rapid, unsteady rhythm of his own heart filled the void. He waited 5 minutes, 10, 15. The wood smoke smell dissipated, carried away by the indifferent currents of the jungle air. He dared to lift his head, just an inch, scanning the path where they had been. Nothing, just the endless green, the oppressive, indifferent silence. Miller slumped back, the adrenaline draining from his body, leaving him weak and shaking. His muscles screamed in protest. Henderson lay still, eyes closed once more, slipping back into the haze of pain and delirium. The jungle hadn't stopped chewing. It had merely paused, allowed the morsels to marinate in terror before the next, inevitable bite. And Miller knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this was just another reprieve, a cruel trick of the light in a world swallowed by shadow. The symphony wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Miller knelt by Henderson, the breath hitched in his throat. Henderson's skin was a clammy canvas of gray, slick with feverish sweat and jungle grime. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps. The wound, a festering maw on his thigh, pulsed with angry heat. The makeshift bandage stained a dark, ominous crimson. Miller's fingers, trembling despite himself, pressed against Henderson's neck. A weak, thready pulse fluttered beneath his touch, a bird struggling against a closing fist. "Henderson, can you hear me?" Miller's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible above the insistent hum of the jungle. No response, just a whimper and a slight tremor through Henderson's emaciated frame. Delirium had claimed him, dragging him deeper into a world of pain and shadow where Miller couldn't follow. The full, crushing weight of their predicament slammed into Miller like a physical blow. He was alone, truly, utterly alone. Henderson was a dead weight, a dying man, and Miller was merely delaying the inevitable. The thought, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of his own exhaustion. He pushed it away, but it lingered, a venomous whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Hours bled into a timeless agony. Miller rigged a crude lean-to of broad palm leaves, not against rain, but against the relentless, blinding sun that beat down through the canopy, turning the air into a suffocating shroud. He rationed the last few drops of muddy water from his canteen, pressing the damp cloth to Henderson's cracked lips, watching it dribble uselessly down his chin. The faint scent of infection hung heavy in the humid air, a morbid perfume. Maggots, he knew, would be next if they didn't move, or if Henderson didn't. He dragged Henderson, inch by agonizing inch, further into the deeper shadows of a thicket, obscuring them from any casual glance. Every grunt, every strained muscle was a testament to the impossible task. Henderson's dead weight seemed to grow with each foot, his limbs floppy, his head lolling sickeningly. Miller felt a dark, primal rage ignite within him. Rage at the jungle, at the VC, at the uncaring gods, and, horrifyingly, at Henderson himself for being so utterly helpless. He choked it down, the bitter taste of guilt coating his tongue. The symphony, as Miller had called it, hadn't paused. It had merely shifted key. The immediate, explosive violence had receded, replaced by the slow, insidious grind of the jungle's decay. The buzz of unseen insects grew to a maddening crescendo. Leeches, fat and glistening, found purchase on Miller's exposed skin, swelling with his blood. He tore them off with a grunt of disgust, his nails leaving streaks of blood on his pallid flesh. Gnats swarmed his eyes and mouth, persistent and maddening. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, sent a spike of adrenaline through him, twisting his gut. Was it a rescue or another patrol? The jungle offered no clear answers, only endless, suffocating ambiguity. Nightfall brought no relief, only a fresh wave of dread. The air grew heavy, pregnant with an approaching storm. Distant thunder rumbled, a slow, predatory growl. Miller huddled close to Henderson, the last remnants of their shared humanity clinging to him like a tattered flag. Henderson thrashed in his sleep, mumbling incoherent pleas to a mother long dead, or perhaps to a phantom nurse. Miller's own mind, frayed at the edges, began to play tricks. He saw movement in the shadows that wasn't there, heard faint voices carried on the wind that morphed into the tortured screams of men. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. Then the heavens opened, not a gentle rain, but a deluge, a solid wall of water that descended with brutal force, tearing through the canopy. The lean-to, a pathetic gesture against such power, shredded almost immediately. Water hammered down, instantly drenching them, turning the ground to a slick, treacherous mud bath. Henderson convulsed, a rattling cough escaping his lips as cold water splashed over his fevered face. The wound, already struggling against infection, was now exposed to the full, unsanitary fury of the monsoon. Miller tried to shield Henderson with his own body, a futile attempt against the relentless torrent. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, his muscles seizing up from the cold. The last of their dry rations, a few crushed crackers in his pack, were now a sodden, unappetizing mush. Their meager, fire-starting materials, carefully hoarded, were undoubtedly ruined. Any hope of drying out, of warding off the chill, evaporated with the downpour. The jungle wasn't merely chewing. It was trying to drown them, to dissolve them into the mud and the rot, to erase their very existence. Miller closed his eyes, the rain stinging them, blurring the world into a chaotic mess of green and gray. He felt his own resolve, once so fiercely held, begin to fracture, cracking under the relentless pressure. He was a small, fragile thing, pitted against an indifferent, monstrous entity. And the monster was winning. The chill evaporated with the downpour. The jungle wasn't merely chewing. It was trying to drown them, to dissolve them into the mud and the rot, to erase their very existence. Miller closed his eyes, the rain stinging them, blurring the world into a chaotic mess of green and gray. He felt his own resolve, once so fiercely held, begin to fracture, cracking under the relentless pressure. He was a small, fragile thing, pitted against an indifferent, monstrous entity. And the monster was winning. The taste in his mouth was metallic coppery, a mix of blood from a bitten tongue and the swampy grit that had found its way into every orifice. His uniform, a second skin of sodden canvas and mildew, chafed against raw sores. His skin felt like ancient parchment, softened and bleached by the ceaseless water, yet taut with fever. He could no longer distinguish the aches of his own body from the pervasive, aching groan of the jungle itself. Every muscle screamed, every joint ground. His feet, a pulpy mess of macerated flesh and leeches, had long since lost the sensation of pain, replaced by a dull, throbbing numbness that occasionally flared into white-hot agony with each step. He opened his eyes, the world still a watery smear. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that tore at his lungs, bringing up a viscous phlegm that tasted of damp earth and something acrid. Beside him, a shadow detached itself from the dripping foliage. Kowalski. His face was a hollowed-out skull, eyes sunken, framed by a week's growth of greasy stubble. He moved like an old man, each limb a separate, protesting entity. Sanchez, the third ghost in their spectral procession, stumbled behind, his head lolling, a vacant stare fixed on some unseen horror in the driving rain. They hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in 2 days, a sparse exchange of guttural sounds. Move, water, stop. Language had become a luxury, a function of a mind not yet fully consumed by the primal struggle for air and forward momentum. The ground beneath them was a slick, churning morass. Each footfall was a gamble, a desperate negotiation with the earth itself. Mud sucked at their boots, trying to claim them, to pull them down into its cold, suffocating embrace. Miller remembered stories of quicksand, of soldiers vanishing without a trace. This was worse. This was slow, deliberate absorption, the jungle patiently kneading them into its primordial dough. A sudden crack, a sickening lurch beneath his foot, and Miller pitched forward, his hands sinking into the muck, his face barely missing a submerged root, sharp as a spear. The breath left his body in a wet gasp. He lay there, for a moment, unable to move, the rain washing over him, indistinguishable from the sweat and tears that pricked at his eyes. "Miller, get up." Kowalski's voice, raspy, seemed to come from far away. There was no pity in it, only urgency. It was the voice of a man pushing a broken machine, knowing it had to move or cease to exist. Miller grunted, pushing himself up, his arms trembling. He tasted mud, felt the cold, slimy film coat his teeth. He looked back at Sanchez, who had stopped, leaning against a tree, his eyes closed. A dark patch bloomed on his trousers. He'd lost control of his bladder again. Or maybe it was dysentery, seeping out of him, carrying what little life force remained. "Sanchez, move your ass," Kowalski snarled, stumbling back to him, grabbing his arm. Sanchez whimpered, a lost child sound, but he pushed off the tree, swaying, following the inexorable pull of Kowalski's grip. They moved on, a ritualistic shuffle through the watery green hell. Time had ceased to be linear. It was a loop, an eternal present of rain, mud, and the relentless, suffocating humidity. Miller's mind began to unravel at the edges. He saw shapes in the trees that weren't there, faces of comrades long dead, the spectral outlines of his mother, the smooth, cool walls of his childhood bedroom. He heard whispers in the downpour, snatches of radio chatter, the distant thump of Huey blades that never materialized. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, then dissolved entirely. He was marching through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, that never ended. Hunger was a dull, constant ache, but it was overshadowed by the thirst for something other than the warm, metallic rain. Their canteens had been empty for days. They drank from puddles, from leaves, from the very air, but it never quenched the deep, parched craving. Fever burned in Miller's veins, a roaring furnace in his core, even as the constant wetness chilled him to the bone. He shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, then sweat poured from him, drenching him further. They stumbled upon a clearing, or what might have once been one. The trees were broken, shredded, blasted to splinters. The ground was scarred with craters, filled with dark, stagnant water. The air here was heavy with a different kind of rot, metallic and sickening. A battlefield, an old one, perhaps, or a new one claimed by the jungle. Miller paused, his eyes scanning the desolate scene. Amidst the chaos, he saw it, a flicker of dull, rusted metal. He walked towards it, his feet dragging, until he stood over a piece of wreckage. The tail fin of a helicopter, half submerged in a crater lake, its paint peeling. a twisted, skeletal reminder of what they were and where they were. "Don't look," Kowalski mumbled, his voice hoarse, pulling Miller's arm, urging him forward. Nothing there but ghosts. But Miller couldn't help but look. The ghosts were everywhere now. They walked beside him, their hollow eyes mirroring his own. They were the men who had failed, the men who had been swallowed. And they watched, waiting for him to join their ranks. Another night fell, or what passed for it in the perpetual gloom. They huddled under the meager shelter of an enormous banyan tree, its aerial roots like grotesque, writhing snakes. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, but the jungle's chorus of unseen insects and rustling creatures seemed to intensify, mocking their exposed vulnerability. Sanchez was delirious, muttering in Spanish, his body racked by shivers and spasms. Miller laid a hand on his forehead. It was burning. He knew Sanchez was fading. There was nothing he could do. No medkit, no warmth, no hope. He looked at Kowalski, who sat hunched, carving aimlessly at a stick with his K-bar. His eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness. But Miller knew he wasn't seeing anything real. They were all seeing their own private hells now. A small sound, a faint, rhythmic thrumming, broke through the drone of the jungle. Miller froze. He strained his ears, convinced it was another hallucination, a trick of his desperate mind. But it came again, louder this time, an insistent, mechanical pulse against the organic symphony of the jungle. "You hear that?" Miller whispered, his voice cracking. Kowalski slowly raised his head, his eyes widening. "Motor, engine," he rasped. Hope, a fragile, almost forgotten sensation, flickered in his dead eyes. It was faint, barely discernible above the drumming rain, but it was there. A human sound, a sign of civilization. It could be anything, a distant patrol, a logging truck, even a village generator. But it was something dash, a direction, a chance, a surge of adrenaline, cold and fierce, ripped through Miller. It was not the heroic surge of a man about to charge, but the desperate, primal jolt of an animal sensing an escape. He nudged Sanchez. "Get up, Sanchez. We're going." Sanchez moaned, but didn't stir. Kowalski bent, hooking his arms under Sanchez's armpits, grunting with effort. "He's dead weight, Miller. We can't carry him." Miller looked at Sanchez's face, slack with fever and exhaustion. This was it, the choice. Leave him to the monster or drag him, futilely, deeper into their shared damnation. But the sound, that distant thrumming, was a siren song, pulling them, demanding they move. "We try," Miller choked out, already moving, stumbling towards the sound, following the faint, impossible thread of hope. Kowalski hesitated for a fraction of a second, then hoisted Sanchez over his shoulder in a grim fireman's carry. The jungle seemed to resist them even more fiercely now, as if sensing their desperate flight. Vines tripped them, thorns snagged their rotting clothes. Unseen roots rose from the mud like grasping claws. Every step was a battle. Sanchez was a dead weight, his body occasionally twitching with fever, his head lolling. Kowalski's breathing became a series of ragged gasps, his face streaked with sweat and mud. Miller, leading the way, felt his own strength draining, his legs threatening to give out with every strained movement. The sound of the engine seemed to recede, then grow louder, playing tricks on his frayed nerves. Was it real? Or was he simply dragging them towards another illusion? Hours blurred into an eternity of pain. His lungs burned, his vision swam, and his body screamed for surrender. He was nothing but a raw nerve, a primal will to survive, stripped of everything else. He pushed through a final thicket of razor grass, stumbling, then froze. Before him, through the driving rain, was a faint, muddy track. Not a path carved by animals, but a wide, flattened scar through the dense foliage. And on it, half hidden by overgrown weeds, a discarded jerrycan. A dull, rusted relic, but undeniably human. The engine noise was louder now, unmistakably real, a persistent drone. And then, through a break in the trees, a flicker of light. An artificial light. Miller collapsed to his knees on the track. the mud welcoming his exhausted frame. Kowalski, still burdened with Sanchez, slowly lowered his comrade to the ground beside him, then sank down himself, gasping, shaking. They had found it, the edge of their hell, a dirt road. They lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the engine grow steadily louder, accompanied now by the faint, muffled hum of tires on mud. Then, through the pouring rain, headlights cut through the gloom. A truck, a dark, military truck, its canvas cover billowing, its engine a throaty growl. It was moving slowly, cautiously, navigating the treacherous track. As it drew closer, Miller could make out the silhouettes of men in the cab. Not enemy, their own. He tried to shout, but his voice was a broken croak. Kowalski, finding some hidden reserve, raised a hand, waving weakly. The truck was almost abreast of them. It slowed, then stopped. A window rolled down. A face, blurred by rain and exhaustion, peered out. Jesus Christ. A voice barked, thick with disbelief. Look at these poor bastards. Two soldiers jumped out, rifles at the ready. Then, seeing the pathetic state of the three figures in the mud, lowered their weapons. They were clean, relatively dry, their uniforms crisp. They looked like giants, like beings from another world. "You all right, soldier?" One of them asked Miller, kneeling down, his voice laced with shock. Miller tried to respond, but all that came out was a wet, rattling cough. He looked at Kowalski, then at Sanchez, whose eyes were now open, staring blankly up at the rain. He was breathing, but barely. The soldiers helped them up, supporting their emaciated bodies. The touch of another human hand, firm and warm, was alien, almost painful. They were loaded into the back of the truck, onto a pile of sandbags. The canvas flap was lowered, sealing them in. The truck began to move, the engine rumbling, carrying them away from the heart of the monster. The relative darkness and enclosed space should have been comforting, but for Miller, it was just a new kind of confinement. He could still feel the jungle pressing in, its damp breath on his skin, its rot in his nostrils. He could still hear its whispers, promising his return. He looked at Kowalski, slumped beside him, his gaze fixed on nothing. He looked at Sanchez, who lay shivering, his breath shallow. They were out. They had survived, but survival was not victory. The monster hadn't won the war, not in the traditional sense of bodies or territory, but it had won something far more insidious. It had burrowed deep into their minds, taken root in their souls. It had stripped them bare, revealed the raw, animalistic core beneath the veneer of civilization. It had shown them a hell no one could describe to the clean-faced men back home. The untold horrors weren't just the enemy, the booby traps, the starvation. They were the slow, agonizing dissolution of self, the creeping madness, the indelible stain of the jungle's indifference. Miller closed his eyes, no longer feeling the sting of the rain. He felt only the tremor of the truck, carrying him away, but not truly out. He was free of the immediate threat, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would carry a piece of that green hell within him forever. The jungle had carved its mark, deep and permanent, and no amount of distance, no amount of time, would ever truly erase it. The war, for him, would never really end.